The ranch had never felt so empty. Once, laughter had echoed through the wide rooms, warm smells of bread and stew filling the air, and the soft hum of a woman's voice weaving itself into the quiet nights. But that was 10 years ago. Now only the creak of wood and the whistle of wind kept the rancher company. His wife had died young, taken by a sudden illness that no amount of prayer or medicine could cure. Her absence had left more than an empty bed. It had hollowed out his world. Where there had once been tenderness, there was now routine. Where there had been joy, there was silence. Each morning, he rose before dawn, pulling on his boots without a word. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and the endless stretch of land demanded care. He worked hard, harder than any man needed to, as if sweat could drown out the ache inside his chest. But when night fell, when the fields turned dark and the stars came out one by one, he could not outrun the stillness that pressed against the walls of his home. The house itself had become a monument to his loss. The chair at the table across from him remained untouched. He couldn't bring himself to move it, just as he couldn't pack away the few dresses still hanging in the closet, their fabric long since faded with time. Her books gathered dust on the shelf, spines cracked from years of use but untouched since her passing. In the bedroom, he still slept on his side of the bed, leaving hers empty, as though waiting for her to return. People in town whispered about him. Some said he was a proud man who had chosen his loneliness. Others pitied him, murmuring that no one should live with ghosts for so long. A few tried to set him up with widows or young women eager to marry into land, but he always refused. He could not imagine another woman in that house, not when every stone, every window, every blade of grass on the ranch still carried the memory of the one he'd buried. Yet he was not a cruel man. Those who worked alongside him knew his steady hand, his fair word, and his quiet strength. He was dependable, as constant as the land itself. But behind his eyes lived a weight, a tired sorrow that no one dared name. The nights were the hardest. He often sat by the fire, staring into the flames until they blurred. A cup of coffee, or sometimes whiskey, sat cooling on the table, untouched. He would think of the way she used to tuck her hair behind her ear, the way she laughed at his clumsy jokes, the way she prayed before meals with her eyes closed tightly as if she could see heaven itself. He would remember, and remembering was both comfort and torment. Loneliness became a habit, as much a part of him as the scar on his hand from years of rope burn or the dust on his boots. He learned to live without expecting company, without expecting joy. He spoke little, smiled less, and poured everything he had into the work of the ranch. The land gave him purpose, even if it could never give him back what he had lost. For 10 years this was his life, the endless cycle of work, silence, and memory. 10 years of eating alone, of hearing only his own footsteps in the hall, of sleeping in a bed that never warmed. And though the world carried on, neighbors marrying, children being born, seasons changing, the rancher remained unchanged. Like a stone weathered by storms but unmoved, a man marked by grief, a man resigned to live out his days in solitude. Until one midnight knock at his door would change everything. The sun was sinking low when he first saw her. The rancher had been out in the far pasture, checking a section of fence where a storm had torn through days before. His hands were rough with splinters, his shirt damp with sweat, when he noticed a lone figure standing at the edge of the property. At first he thought it was a drifter. Strangers sometimes cut across his land in search of work or water. But as she stepped closer, her face caught the light, and recognition struck him like a blow. It was her. His wife's younger sister. He hadn't seen her in years. The last time had been at the funeral. She was barely more than a girl then, with tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands, clutching her mother's shawl. Now, standing before him, she was a woman worn by hardship. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, faded and frayed. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt. Her shoes looked as though they had carried her across too many miles. Yet it was her eyes that told the truest story, eyes dulled by hunger, sharpened by fear, but still carrying a spark, he remembered. "Evening," she said softly, her voice raw from travel. He didn't answer right away. He felt the weight of the years between them and the awkwardness of her sudden return. The memories pressed in, of his wife, of family dinners long gone, of a time when this woman was only the younger sister hovering at the edge of laughter. Now she stood on his land, no longer sheltered by youth. Finally, he nodded. "You've come a long way," she smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Longer than I care to remember." He saw then how thin she was, how her hands trembled when she gripped the strap of her bag. He realized she hadn't just wandered here. She had come because she had nowhere else to go. "May I stay?" she asked, her voice breaking on the words. "Just for a while." "I won't be any trouble." The rancher's first instinct was to guard himself. His life was ordered now, even in its loneliness. Bringing someone into it, especially her, would stir things he had long since buried. But he looked at her shoes, split at the seams, and at the way she stood with her shoulders slumped, as if she were carrying not just her bag, but the weight of the whole world. "You'll stay," he said simply. Relief flooded her face, though she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded and followed him to the house. Inside, the silence between them was thick. She glanced around at the bare walls, the dust-dulled shelves, the empty chair across from his at the table. It was as though she could see the life that had been lost here, and for a moment her expression softened with something like sorrow. "I can work," she said quickly, almost defensively. "Cook, clean, whatever needs doing. I don't expect anything for free." He shook his head. "No one's keeping score." Still, he saw how she held herself, proud despite her exhaustion, unwilling to be a burden. She reminded him of his wife in that way, though the resemblance ended there. His wife had been light and laughter. Her sister was shadow and steel, shaped by survival. That night he gave her the spare room, long unused. As she laid her small bag on the bed, she whispered a thank you so quiet it nearly broke him. When he returned to his own room, he sat for a long time in the dark, staring at the wall. The house had been silent for a decade, its stillness like a shroud. Now, for the first time in years, he could hear another presence moving in the next room, the creak of a floorboard, the soft closing of a door. And though nothing had been said outright, he knew life at the ranch would never be the same again. The days that followed her arrival were quiet, yet far from empty. The rancher had been used to silence. It was the rhythm of his life, the companion he had lived with for 10 long years. But the silence now felt different. It wasn't the hollow, aching stillness of grief. It was watchful, shifting, filled with the awareness of another soul moving through the same walls. Her presence unsettled him in ways he didn't speak aloud. When he caught sight of her hanging laundry in the morning sun, the shape of her figure against the breeze, it tugged at something buried deep within him. For a fleeting second he would see his wife again, the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair caught the light. And then guilt would stab him, sharp and merciless. He would turn away quickly, reminding himself that this was not her, and never would be. Yet the memories rose without permission. At the table, when she bowed her head before eating, he thought of the way his wife used to pray. When she hummed softly while sweeping the floor, he was carried back to nights when song had filled the house. Even the small things, her laughter, quiet but genuine, or the way she scolded him gently for forgetting his hat in the sun, echoed with ghosts. But she was not a ghost. She was flesh and blood, standing in his kitchen, moving through his halls, bringing life to a house that had lain dormant for too long. And he began to notice the ways she was different. His wife had been gentle but quick to laugh, eager to soften every sharp edge. Her sister, by contrast, was steady and guarded. She moved with the precision of someone who had known hunger, who measured every portion, saved every scrap. Where his wife had leaned on him with trust, her sister carried herself like a woman who had learned she could rely on no one but herself. That contrast struck him hardest at night. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds from the next room, the creak of her bed frame, the rustle of blankets. Those sounds stirred an ache in him that was not grief, not exactly. It was something harder to name. A longing he had thought himself too old, too wounded to feel again. She, too, seemed caught between past and present. He noticed how her eyes lingered on his wife's belongings, still untouched. Once, he found her standing at the bookshelf, running her hand over the spines, whispering the titles under her breath. Another time, she lingered by the kitchen window, gazing at the garden her sister once tended, now overrun with weeds. There was sorrow in her face, but also something else, an unspoken question, perhaps even guilt. Did she feel like an intruder here? Did she fear she was stepping into a shadow too large to escape? Neither of them spoke of it. Their conversations remained simple: the weather, the cattle, the chores. And yet beneath every word lay an undercurrent, an unspoken thread binding memory to the present moment. The townsfolk, when they heard she had come to stay, wasted no time in speculation. Some whispered that she was there to replace the sister she had lost. Others hinted the rancher had finally found himself a woman again. He ignored the talk, but in the quiet of his own mind, the whispers had a way of echoing. Each day he told himself the same truth. She was not his wife. She could never be. But each night, when her presence haunted the halls, he felt the weight of another truth pressing harder. She was here. She was real. And something between them was stirring that neither could ignore forever. The storm came without warning. One moment the night was calm. The prairie stretched beneath a wide, starlit sky. The next, wind howled across the plains, rattling shutters and bending trees until they groaned. Rain hammered the roof, seeping through cracks that hadn't seen water in months. Thunder rolled in deep, shaking waves, and lightning flashed so bright it split the darkness like a blade. The rancher lay awake in bed, listening. Storms had never bothered him. He was used to the unpredictability of land and weather, but that night felt different. The house no longer belonged to him alone. He thought of the woman sleeping in the spare room, her sister's room once, and wondered if she was frightened. Then came the sound. A knock, faint, almost swallowed by the storm. He sat up, thinking he had imagined it. But then it came again, hesitant, uncertain, yet insistent enough to cut through the wind. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, pulled on his shirt, and went to the door. When he opened it, she stood there, a shadow trembling in the dim glow of the lantern. Her hair was loose, damp from the storm, her face pale as lightning lit the hall behind her. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. He looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't a girl anymore, but in that instant, she looked as fragile as one. Her hands twisted together, restless, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from something deeper: loneliness, fear, the kind that gnaws at you in the dark until you can't breathe. "Storm bothering you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not just the storm." Her eyes lifted to his then, and for a heartbeat, he saw everything she didn't say. The miles of hardship she had walked to reach his door. The nights of hunger, the burden of being unwanted, unseen. The way the world had stripped her down until she believed she had nothing left. I didn't mean to wake you," she said, stepping back as if she regretted coming. I couldn't be alone tonight." The rancher's chest tightened. For years he had lived alone, convinced solitude was the only way forward. But seeing her standing there, soaked in stormlight, he understood a truth he hadn't faced. No one was meant to carry life entirely alone. "Come inside," he said softly. She hesitated, then stepped across the threshold. The storm raged against the walls, but in the flicker of lantern light, the space between them felt charged with a different kind of thunder. She stood close enough that he could see the fine lines of wear around her eyes, the way her lips trembled even as she tried to hold herself steady. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy with things unspoken: grief, longing, fear, and the fragile hope of being seen. Finally, she exhaled, a shaky breath. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she admitted. I couldn't bear it tonight. The quiet, the memories, the emptiness. Her words struck him like a mirror held to his own soul. He knew that emptiness better than anyone. For 10 years, it had been his only companion. And now, standing before him, was someone who carried the same ache. The storm raged on, but in that moment, the rancher realized something had shifted. She had come to his door not just seeking shelter from the weather, but from the darkness inside her. And though neither dared say it aloud, both knew nothing between them would ever be quite the same after this night. The storm did not ease quickly. Rain hammered the roof for hours, and the wind clawed at the shutters like a restless spirit. The rancher had built his house sturdy, but even he felt the weight of the storm pressing in that night. Inside, lantern light cast long shadows, and the silence between him and his wife's sister was thick, broken only by the crackle of fire. She sat at the edge of the chair near the hearth, her hands twisting in her lap. He could see she was wrestling with something, her eyes darting to him and then away, her shoulders tense as though bracing herself against words she hadn't yet spoken. "Finally," she said almost in a whisper, "you've given me a roof, a bed, food?" "More than I deserve," he frowned, leaning forward. "Deserve? Your family?" Her mouth curved in a bitter, humorless smile. "Family? I don't feel like anyone's family anymore. Out there," she gestured vaguely toward the storm-lashed windows, "no one cares if I live or die. I came here with nothing. I still have nothing." The rancher wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. They weren't the eyes of someone fishing for pity. They were the eyes of someone who had walked too many hard miles, who had been turned away too many times. She swallowed hard, then whispered words that struck him like a whip. "I could give myself to you." The room seemed to still, though the storm roared on outside. He stared at her, stunned. She couldn't meet his gaze. Her hands twisted harder in her lap, her shoulders trembling. "You've been alone a long time," she continued, her voice shaking. "And She stopped, drew in a ragged breath, then forced herself to go on. "I've nothing else of value. If it keeps me here, if it keeps me safe, take me. I won't fight it." The rancher's chest tightened with a storm fiercer than the one outside. Anger, sorrow, and something like despair warred inside him. Anger, not at her, but at the life that had brought her to this place, convinced her she was worth nothing but the trade of her body. Sorrow, that she thought so little of herself. And despair, that she stood in his home, his wife's sister, offering him something he could never take without shame. He rose from his chair, the movement sharp enough that she flinched. "Stop," he said firmly, his voice carrying more weight than thunder. Her eyes flew to his, wide and wet, bracing for rejection, perhaps even cruelty. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low, steady. "You are not payment. You are not a bargain to be struck. You don't buy your place under this roof." Her lips parted, confusion flickering across her face. "You came here tired, hungry, worn down. That don't make you less, and it sure as hell don't mean I'd ever take advantage of you. You're safe here, whether you believe it or not." For a long moment, the only sound was the storm. She stared at him, eyes shining with unshed tears, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded, though he could see how deeply the words had shaken her. He returned to his chair, but the air between them was changed. Her dangerous suggestion had stripped them bare, no longer just man and guest, but two wounded souls forced to confront the raw truth of what survival had cost them. And though the storm outside would pass by dawn, the memory of her offer and his refusal would linger long after. The fire had burned low, its glow fading into embers, but the weight of her words lingered in the air long after she had spoken them. The rancher sat in silence, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer in their restless dance. Across from him, she shifted uneasily in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had offered him something she thought was all she had left to give, and though he had already refused, she seemed unable to believe him. "You don't have to pretend," she murmured, her voice thin, brittle. "I've seen how men look at women when they're hungry for more than food. I know what's expected of someone like me." Her words cut him deeper than he expected. He lifted his gaze, meeting hers squarely, his expression hard. "You think I'm that kind of man? The sort who'd take what's offered out of desperation?" She flinched, then shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't mean—" She stopped, sighed, and dropped her eyes again. I don't want to be cast out when you've already done so much." For a moment, he said nothing. The storm outside thrashed against the house, wind howling through cracks in the shutters, rain pelting the roof in sheets. But inside, his voice was steady, anchored. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Not because you've got something to trade, and not because I'm some lonely fool ready to forget myself. You stay because you're meant to. Because you've got worth that has nothing to do with what you give away." Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked at him as if she wanted to believe, but years of rejection, of being treated as little more than a burden, weighed too heavily. The rancher leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His tone softened, though his eyes stayed fierce. "You've walked a long, hard road. I can see it in your face. Life's taught you to think you ain't worth much. But hear me, that's a lie. My house isn't bought with flesh or fear. It's held together by work, by trust, by decency. And if you're willing, you'll find you've got all three." Silence stretched between them again, but it was different now. Not heavy with shame, but with the fragile beginning of trust. She swallowed hard, her throat working as she blinked back tears she didn't want him to see. "Why?" she whispered at last. "Why would you care enough to say that?" He hesitated, then answered with the only truth he knew. "Because I've lived with ghosts for too long. I won't turn a living soul into one more." Her breath caught, and for the first time, her posture eased. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as if his words had given her something she hadn't carried in years. Relief. They didn't speak of it again that night. When she rose, he stood as well, guiding her toward the hall with nothing more than a nod. At her door, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the frame. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though she wanted to say more. Instead, she simply whispered, "Thank you," and slipped inside. He returned to his own room, but sleep did not come quickly. He lay awake, listening to the storm fade into quiet, her words echoing in his mind, mingling with his own. She had offered him herself, not out of love, but out of despair. And though he had refused, he knew the moment had carved a line between past and future. From that night forward, their bond would be tested, reshaped, and deepened. Not because of what she had offered, but because of what he had denied, and the dignity he had returned to her in refusing. Morning came soft and clear after the storm, the air washed clean, the earth damp and fragrant with rain. The rancher rose early, as always, but when he stepped into the kitchen, something had changed. The smell of coffee already lingered in the air, and a plate of biscuits sat cooling on the table. She stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, moving with quiet purpose. "You didn't have to," he said, surprised. "I wanted to," she answered without turning, her voice steady. "It feels good to be useful again." That simple exchange set the tone for the days that followed. Life on the ranch fell into a rhythm, 2 sets of hands instead of one, 2 voices instead of silence. Where once he had eaten cold bread by himself, now there were warm meals at the table. Where chores had stretched long and weary, now there was help with laundry, mending, and the endless cleaning that a working ranch demanded. But it wasn't just her labor that changed the place. It was the life she brought with her. She hummed softly as she worked, nothing more than a whisper of melody, yet enough to stir the air. She spoke kindly to the animals when feeding them, laughed at the ranch dog's antics, and even coaxed him into conversation while they worked side by side. At first he was guarded, uncertain. For so long, the ranch had been his fortress of solitude, a place where grief had kept him company. But slowly he began to feel the weight lifting. He found himself answering her questions, sharing bits of knowledge about the land, the cattle, the weather. He even caught himself telling old stories from his younger days, things he hadn't spoken aloud in years. In return, she began to share pieces of herself. She spoke of the years after her sister's death, of how their family had splintered, of how she had tried to make her way alone. Work was scarce, food scarcer. She had learned to survive on scraps, to hide her fear behind a straight back. Her words carried no self-pity, only the blunt honesty of someone who had endured more than she should have. One evening, after supper, he found her in the yard, kneeling by the garden that had long been overtaken by weeds. She had pulled a section clean, the soil dark and damp from the storm. "Thought I might bring it back," she said when she noticed him watching. "Your wife always loved this garden. Seemed wrong to leave it to wild things." His throat tightened, but he only nodded. She did. Together, they cleared the rows, planted seeds she had saved from her journey, and watered the ground. It became their shared project, a symbol of something growing between them that neither dared to name. The neighbors, of course, noticed the change. When he rode into town for supplies, more than one pair of curious eyes followed him. Questions lingered in the air. How long would she stay? What sort of arrangement had been made? He ignored the whispers, but deep down he knew such talk would only grow louder. Back at the ranch, though, none of it mattered. What mattered was the laughter that now echoed softly through the halls, the warmth of meals shared, the sense of partnership in the day's work. And yet, beneath it all, there was still an undercurrent, something unspoken but undeniable. When their hands brushed while passing a dish, when their eyes met and lingered a moment too long, when silence stretched between them, not as emptiness, but as possibility, they had begun to build something fragile, something neither had expected, a new rhythm, steady and slow, like the turning of seasons, and though neither dared say it aloud, both knew this was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Night had a way of settling differently on the ranch now. It was no longer the crushing silence of grief, nor the hollow echo of an empty house. Instead, it carried with it a softer stillness, alive with the knowledge that another soul was near. The days were long, filled with work. But it was in the evenings, after the chores were done and the lamps were lit, that something new began to take shape between them. At first, their conversations were light, safe. She asked about the cattle, about the land, about the storms that rolled through with such sudden fury. He told her about the routines he had lived by for years, how the ranch demanded constancy, how little room it left for anything else. She listened intently as though each word carried weight. But as the nights stretched on, their words deepened. One evening after supper, they sat by the fire while the wind rattled the windows. She stared into the flames, her hands clasped in her lap, and whispered, "Do you ever stop hearing them?" "Hearing who?" he asked. "The voices of those you've lost." He was quiet for a long moment. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, and he thought of his wife's laughter, the way it still echoed in the corners of his memory. "No," he admitted at last. "You don't stop hearing them, you just learn to live with the sound." She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes, though she blinked them away before they could fall. Then slowly, she began to share her own burdens. The years she had wandered from place to place, working where she could, never truly welcome anywhere. She told him about the nights she had gone to bed hungry, the mornings she had risen with nothing but the will to keep moving. Her voice trembled when she spoke of kindnesses that had been rare, of cruelties that had been all too common. He listened, saying little, but his silence was not empty. It was steady, anchoring, giving her the space to unburden what she had carried for so long. On another night, it was his turn. He told her of the first year after his wife's death, how the ranch had nearly fallen to ruin because he couldn't bring himself to care, how he had sat for hours staring at the fields, unable to move, convinced nothing mattered without her. He spoke of the guilt that he had lived when she had not, guilt that no amount of hard work could scrub away. She reached across the table then, her hand brushing his. It was not bold, not romantic, just a quiet gesture of understanding. "You did the best you could," she said softly. "That's all any of us can do." From then on, the nights grew easier. They lingered by the fire longer, spoke more freely. Sometimes the words were heavy, sometimes they were light. Memories of childhood, stories of mistakes made and lessons learned. And sometimes, when words ran out, silence stretched between them, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of two people who knew they were no longer alone. He found himself waiting for those moments each day, the soft glow of lamplight, the quiet cadence of her voice, the way her eyes softened when she finally allowed herself to rest. She, too, seemed to find comfort in the ritual, her shoulders easing, her laughter returning in small, surprising bursts. It was in those whispers in the dark that something unspoken grew between them, a fragile bond, rooted not in desperation or duty but in the simple, powerful act of being seen, and though neither dared name it yet, both felt the truth. They were no longer just survivors of their own loneliness. They were beginning to heal together. The ranch had grown warmer with her presence, steadier with her help, but the world beyond their fence lines had not failed to notice. Small towns are places where little escapes the eye, and whispers travel faster than horse hooves. It began with lingering stares. When the rancher rode into town for feed, he noticed folks tipping their hats with a certain knowing look. Some were curious, others critical. At first he ignored it. What he did on his land was his business. But gossip is a weed. It takes root quickly, even when unwelcome. One morning, at the general store, he overheard two women speaking in hushed tones just beyond the barrels of flour. "That's her, ain't it? His late wife's sister?" one murmured. "Living out there with him all this time," the other replied, shaking her head. "Doesn't sit right with me. Ain't proper." The rancher's jaw tightened. He paid for his goods without a word, but their voices followed him out the door like nettles clinging to his coat. For her, the judgment was harsher still. On her rare visits into town, she felt the weight of every glance. Some eyes carried pity, others disdain. Children whispered, women whispered louder. Men, emboldened by the talk, sometimes looked too long, their gazes less than kind. One evening, she returned from a short errand with her shoulders hunched, her eyes glassy. He noticed the way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands trembled as she unpacked a small bundle of sewing thread and needles. "What happened?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Nothing," she said quickly. Too quickly. He stepped closer. "Tell me." Finally, she looked up, her eyes shimmering with humiliation. "They called me shameless. Said I was living off you like some stray that found a warm barn." The rancher's chest burned hot with anger, but he reined it in. Instead, he reached for her hands, stilling them. "You're not a stray, and you're not shameless. You work as hard as I do, maybe harder. Don't you let their poison take root in you?" She nodded, though her lips quivered, and he could see how deeply the words had wounded her. That night, as they sat by the fire, he thought long about what the town whispered, and about what it might mean if he didn't answer it. But word spread, as it always does. Men at the saloon chuckled into their whiskey. Women at church pursed their lips. It was not cruelty so much as a slow tightening of judgment, a constant reminder that the world had its rules and they were straying beyond them. The rancher felt the pressure most keenly when an old friend, a neighboring cattleman, rode up one afternoon. They talked of grazing rights, of the weather, of the upcoming cattle drive, until at last the man leaned in his saddle and said quietly, "I'll speak plain. Folks are talking. They don't understand what's happening out here, you and her under the same roof." The rancher's eyes hardened. "They don't need to understand, maybe not. But it won't stop the talk, and talk can turn to trouble." When the man rode off, the rancher stood in the yard long after, staring at the horizon. He had lived alone so long he had forgotten how swiftly the world could pass judgment. Now, with her under his roof, he realized their choices were no longer just their own. Inside the house, she moved about quietly, unaware of the conversation. He watched her through the window, saw the way she tended the table with care, and felt the pull in his chest. She deserved safety, not whispers. Respect, not shame. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the only way to silence the town's judgment was to give them something else to talk about. Something undeniable. Something official. But that step would demand more than he was sure either of them was ready to give. The tension in town hung heavy, like storm clouds that refused to break. The rancher felt it every time he rode down the dusty main street, every time he caught the curious glances and tight-lipped whispers. She felt it more keenly still, the sting of judgment from women who had once been her neighbors, the unspoken accusations in every lingering look. For weeks, they lived with the weight of it. He tried to shield her, tried to tell himself that it didn't matter what others thought. But deep down, he knew better. In a small town, a reputation wasn't just words, it was survival. A man's name, a woman's honor, the respect of neighbors, these things carried more weight than cattle or land. One night, as they sat by the fire, she broke the silence with a whisper. "Maybe I should leave." The word struck him like a blow. He turned to her sharply, his voice rough. "Leave? Why?" She kept her eyes on the flames. "You've given me shelter, a chance to rest, a place to belong. But the town, they won't ever see it that way. And I won't be the reason they drag your name through the mud." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at her until she finally looked up. "You think I care what they say?" "You should," she replied softly. "A man can't live long if the whole town turns against him." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he rose, pacing the room, fighting a battle inside himself. He had been alone for so many years, his heart locked tight in grief. But she had brought life back into his home, laughter back into the air, warmth back into his bones. The thought of her walking away now filled him with a fear deeper than any storm. At last, he stopped, turned toward her, and spoke with the same steady voice he once used to break horses. "If there's judgment to face, I'll face it head on. But I'll be damned if I let you go because of their whispers." Her eyes widened, searching his face for the truth of his words. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her, and took her hands in his rough, calloused ones. "You said once you had nothing to give," he said, his voice gentler now. "But you've given me more than I thought I'd ever have again. Hope. A reason to keep going. That's worth more than any gold, more than any land." Her breath caught, tears shining in her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he answered, steady and sure, "that I don't want you to leave. Not tomorrow, not ever. Stay here, with me, as my wife." The room was silent, save for the steady crackle of the fire. She stared at him, trembling, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, slowly, as though afraid to believe, she nodded. "Yes, I'll stay." Relief washed over him, fierce and overwhelming. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in years, the ranch felt whole again. In the weeks that followed, the town's whispers changed tune. Some still frowned, some still judged, but a wedding has a way of silencing wagging tongues. And when they stood together as husband and wife, the rancher felt a peace he had not known since his first love had left this earth. The ranch was no longer a place of solitude and sorrow. It was a place of laughter, of work done side by side, of hope planted in the garden rows and carried in every dawn. And though grief never truly left a man, he knew now it could share space with love. For after years of loneliness, he had found something worth holding on to again.